Joining us today. I'm Madeline Wimmer. I'm the fruit production educator for the University of Minnesota Extension. And our noon webinar topic today is going to be pollinator support for specialty crop farms. Um, so I guess we'll get started. This talk will be recorded. It will eventually be on YouTube, but it takes just a little bit because it's a busy season and I have to get subtitles uploaded and make sure that they actually make sense for those who benefit from that. So stay tuned. When this is posted, it will get posted onto our Small Farms YouTube channel. So that's UMN Small Farms. If you ever want to find this video in the future or any other videos from Extension, there's lots of good stuff on there. So this presentation will probably take about the total of the noon hour. I don't think we'll have to go overtime, but we will be leaving questions until the end. So feel free to put anything in the chat if you do have a burning question and you don't want to wait to share it at the end. You're welcome to do that. And as we're getting started here, I just want to acknowledge a number of my colleagues who were recently on a grant project related to pollinator support on specialty crop farms. So Marissa Shu, I'll really point her out because she is our vegetable integrated pest management educator, and she's very knowledgeable about pollinator support on vegetable farms. We will be covering a good amount of information that is very relevant to vegetable farms today. But if you have any specific questions about vegetable crops and pollinators, I'll probably be steering you over to talk to Marissa. Katie Lee, she is our honeybee educator, and she also is going to be a wealth of knowledge. So again, some of those questions might be directed towards her if you're really here to learn more about honeybee management in regards to specialty crops. And then a couple of other folks, Gigi DiGiacomo and Bill Hutchinson, who were recently on this grant that we worked on with pollinator partnerships. And it's kind of exciting to be able to announce, oftentimes universities are involved with grants. And for this specific grant, we actually created a whole guide for the Midwest to help you all read more about supporting pollinators and agricultural landscapes. We do have some hard copies of this. And it is available online. You can follow this QR code. And I think Lauren, who is here supporting this webinar today, will be dropping the link in the chat as well. But this is kind of a larger guide. It's a really good one to check out when you have a little bit more time. It is more visual, a little bit more updated, but this was a collaboration with the University of Minnesota Extension, and Pollinator Partnership. So I hope you have a chance to check it out if you'd like. In addition to that, we also created a new landing page, which just is basically a web page that leads to a number of different other web pages about how you can support pollinators on your farm. So you can check that out. This is a new web page or website that we created, through the University of Minnesota Extension to support you in your journey. So number of things on there, including a couple of videos. And that guide is also linked on there as well if you're ever trying to find it again. So we'll get started here by talking about both fruit and vegetable requirements when it comes to insect pollinators. And this is a chart here that really shows in regards to fruit crops where some fruit crops really absolutely require insect pollination. Some are going to benefit. There's some where we're still learning a little bit more, they might benefit. And then there's other crops that might be more wind pollinated. And there's potentially a little bit of benefit, right? But they're probably pretty good on their own. So I'm highlighting apples on, as a major crop that really require insect facilitated pollination. Honeyberries probably should be on there, and apples and honeyberries, they're not self-fertile. Apples tend to require, another variety that blooms around the same time. With honeyberries, it's a little bit more complicated. They don't like plants that are too closely related. So, this chart just kind of help you understand, right, that everybody can benefit from planting pollinator habitat, but some crops really require insect pollination more than other crops do. And benefits for certain berries, that's going to, increase fruit size sometimes, increase yield overall, and overall success of pollination. When it comes to vegetable crops that require insect pollination, things like cucumbers, pumpkins, summer squash, winter squash, right? Cucurbit crops have really co-evolved with a lot of pollinators in North America. They benefit from it. And there's just a small note here. If you're ever doing greenhouse, cucumber production, for example, and you might have something called parthenocarpic cucumbers, which means that they do not require shared pollination or to have success, or I'm sorry, they will be seedless, excuse me. Um, they may end up with seeds if you have insect pollinators around. So that's kind of the one time where you might actually want to exclude pollinators. But for the most part, we're in a place where it's really good to have pollinators overall. Tomatoes and peppers benefit from insect pollination, and tomatoes are kind of a classic crop where buzz pollination, which we'll mention a little bit later, is really helpful for them. And this is a technique that bumblebees really implement. And then there are going to be vegetable crops that, will actually attract pollinators, even though we're not necessarily eating the fruits of their labor. So things like asparagus, sweet corn, potatoes, sweet corn being the exception, right? Because we're eating the seeds of the crop. Asparagus and potatoes, we're not really caring that much about the blossoms themselves, but they still attract pollinators, which means that being more aware of your pest management practices is going to be really important to protecting pollinators in this case. And this is a chart here. I think this was shared by Elaine Evans from the Bee Lab. Just kind of to get us thinking a little bit more about how many bees there actually are in the United States. And of course, there's a number of other, insect species and even birds and animals that can help with pollination in general. But when it comes to specialty crops, we're really talking about bees here. And so there's, what do we usually think of when we think of bees? Oftentimes, most people are going to think of honeybees. They might know bumblebees. Maybe they are aware of a couple of other bees, but there's so many different species of bees, around 3,600 in the United States alone, that we're not necessarily thinking about all the time. And those other bees are going to be different wild bees that may be social, so they may live in colonies, or they might be solitary, so they might just be, on their own, nesting on their own. And there's a variety of different bees. We'll mention just a few of those today, but this is again just kind of knowledge reach. In Minnesota, we have an estimate of over 500 bee species. And we have this program called the Minnesota Bee Atlas, which is a part of iNaturalist that you can actually take part in as, a feature of citizen science, where there's around 2,500 volunteers that help track bees. And there's usually about 230 to 250 species that have been tracked through this process. So that's pretty cool. Um, so examples of pollinators that we'll mention today, honeybees, bumblebees, mason bees, also known as orchard bees at times, cellophane bees, and longhorn bees, example being squash bees there. What does it mean to support pollinators on your farm? So I kind of like to split this up into two categories that you can think of. Supply. So we want to make sure that pollinators have enough resources, they have food available, water, and shelter during the time periods that they need them, as well as protection. So we're protecting pollinators with good pest management as well as good land management practices. So there's a number of different things that this could mean, and this is directly from the guide that I had pulled up. So again, we'll go into more details about this today. And if you're wondering really where to start, you want to support pollinators on your farm for whatever reason. Maybe you want to make sure you're having good yields, fruit set, fruit size and shape, uniformity of yield, or maybe you're really focused on the ecology aspects of everything. maybe both. Maybe you're one of those exceptions where you're also interested in apiculture and honey production. So maybe that's also important to you. You're going to want to think about, which pollinators are you trying to target? So are you really trying to maintain wild populations or build wild populations of bees on your site? As well as, this has other benefits of having like predatory insects and other beneficial insects that, different pollinator plantings can help. Or are you trying to bring in managed bees like honeybees or other bees? And so we'll start with this topic of talking about managed bees on the farm, which honeybees really dominate the managed bees sector. And they are social, right? I mean, the whole point, right? We have colonies of bees and they are powerful by their numbers. So honeybees are really going to be helpful because they're in abundance. However, honeybees only fly about 2 miles from their hive, so it's really helpful to know in regards to thinking about, placement and numbers of colonies that you want to put out. They are a little bit more sensitive, so they really don't like to fly when it's colder or cloudier. So when it comes to temperatures, they're going to, decline in how much they want to fly below temperatures of 55 degrees, or, when things get above 100, which we're not necessarily going to see that for a lot of bloom, depending on the crop that you're working with. But it's just helpful to recognize that they don't really like to fly when it's raining or when it's too windy. So honeybees are a little bit more sensitive. They're domesticated. They're not wild bees. Um, and in general, if you are interested in working with honeybees, there's kind of these two options, right? Where, again, that route where you might be interested in honey production for yourself, you may want to manage colonies yourself. And if you're going to manage your own colonies, there's benefits to that because you really get a lot of the control of what you're doing. It takes a lot of knowledge in order to do this, but you can move your hives around if needed. You get to control when you want to put them out, especially, if bloom comes a little bit earlier than anticipated, for example. And again, there's a value added component where you might be also just producing honey and having that as a value added product. And so the more common route I would say would be that folks are contracting or they're renting colonies from a beekeeper. And this is helpful, right? Because you don't necessarily have to have that extra knowledge gain in order to actually have honeybees on your site. But there are a number of considerations to really think about. So if you're new and you're interested in contracting with somebody who rents out honeybees, you really want to think about how many colonies you want per acre. And even though honeybees can fly up to 2 miles, it's still recommended that you have about 1 to 3 colonies per acre, depending on the crop. Three might be a little bit heavy, but this is going to really depend on the population size per colony. So honeybees are going to be, their colonies are measured typically in frames per colony. And so at minimum, you're looking for something like 3 to 8 frames. And at a maximum size, or ideal size, somewhere between 8 to 10 frames. And this can be really helpful because if you have a high number of frames per colony and you're still not getting good pollination, maybe something else happened that year. Maybe it was a really hot period and the bloom period was super short. Maybe it was really rainy, something like that. But if you were at a lower frame rate and you got poor pollination and the weather was all good, that's at a point where maybe you need to start thinking about upping the frames per colony. So you might want to be thinking about how much notification a beekeeper will need before delivering those colonies. Things like payment, timing of payment, liability, who's going to be responsible if something doesn't work out or something gets damaged. And some beekeepers will work with strict contracts, whereas others may not. So those are things to kind of think about. If you are working with somebody who has a contract, some points you might see and want to think about. Again, this number and minimum size of the colonies, as in the frame rates. When will those colonies be delivered? What's the price and payment? All of that. What chemicals are allowed when those honeybees are present? What is the liability like? And then how are they going to be removed? At some point, a beekeeper may need to move colonies, right? And so things like, are you giving them, is there a lock gate that they need to get behind? Have you sprayed recently? And what is the re-entry period? So making sure that you're staying in contact with them and more contact, the better, right? Versus kind of just assuming things is going to be really helpful and keep a good relationship between you and the beekeeper. When directing where those colonies should be delivered, you want to make sure that the areas are flat, so they're, leveled out. There's no risk of flooding. They're not like in a valley or anything like that. And just recognizing again, these colonies typically need to be removed or moved around when things are dark outside because bee activity decreases during the nighttime. And so again, we've got, if you're really, this is your journey, this is what you're kind of working on right now. We have a few publications out there about getting to know commercial beekeepers or kind of understanding what it takes to protect commercial colonies. Um, Couple of links there. And then this is just a picture of Katie Lee with her contact information. She's really knowledgeable about all these topics. This is her whole job, right? Whereas I do multiple things. And so if you have some tough questions, she'll be able to answer that for you. In addition to honeybees, bumblebees can also be purchased. You can also purchase orchard bees as well, but bumblebees are kind of your next most popular item, especially, again, this is going to be more appropriate for berry crops where honeybees actually will show some research in a little bit here, but honeybees are a little less efficient with berry crops than what bumblebees are. So there are bumblebee colonies that you can rent. And from a colleague of mine in Washington, she really recommends the Bombus impatiens from either Copert or BioPest. Those are a couple of sources. There's probably others out there that are reputable, but those were some recommendations from her. And then just recognizing that there is this need to exclude wild queens. So this isn't really a passive process. You still need to be active, keeping your colonies out of the elements. So they need to be stored in a dry place that stays dry. And you want to keep them away from honeybee colonies because if honeybees are in a position where there's not a lot of resources around, they may try to go into bumblebee colonies in order to take pollen, something just to kind of be aware of. And sort of the sad part about all of this, that is just kind of a reality of what we're working with, is that there's a recommendation to actually terminate colonies after pollination finishes. And this is because these managed bees can transfer diseases to wild bees. So how do you terminate them? Freezing is often the most recommended way, which hopefully that's a viable thing for you if you have, ability to access a walk-in freezer or a freezer chest. That's typically, maybe it's questionable about how humane any amount of termination is, but this is again for the purpose of protecting wild bees from certain diseases that might transfer. So just kind of a heads up about that. Now we're going to move on to this topic of wild bees. I'm going to start by just kind of discussing who these bees are, and then we'll get into the topic of habitat production. And if we have time, we'll cover more about integrated pest management practices, about protecting wild pollinators. So again, the Midwest, this is not Minnesota, but the Midwest overall has about 800 bee species. There's over 500 in Minnesota, but typically about 250 that I've seen. Um, and just recognizing again, I'm sure those of you who are on the call have heard and understand that there's kind of this issue of decline with wild pollinators. So we've lost a lot in previous decades. And sometimes people will call wild pollination free pollination as compared to renting colonies, but just recognizing that, again, this is not a passive process. Sometimes it might be depending what's on your farm, but in general, you want to make sure that you are having good habitat of flowers and you want all of these resources to be throughout the year. So oftentimes, depending on what crop you're working with, there's kind of a single bloom period But we want to make sure that we're providing resources throughout the year so they can stay happy, they can overwinter, they have access to water, especially during drought years. Thinking about years like 2024 when we really entered a strong drought by the end of the year, if there's no water, they're going to be declining. And we want to protect them while we maintain pest management practices, whether you're working with organic products or conventional products. It's still important if you are working with any chemical products to know how to manage your pests while protecting pollinators. So we mentioned all these bees a little bit earlier. I did not mention sweat bees earlier, but mason bees, bumblebees, cellophane bees, mining bees, sweat bees, these are all pollinators relevant to specialty crop production. And the decline that I mentioned earlier, this really relates to primarily habitat loss due to agricultural land being installed, due to, development, things like that. But there's also issues that have been in the news, like diseases that affect wild bees, parasites, invasive species, pesticide exposure. And then recognizing, as we talked about with the bumblebees a little bit, there's also issues with honeybees transferring diseases to wild bee populations. So there's this concept called pathogen spillover, where a honeybee, if it's sick, it can visit a flower. It leaves some of its own, disease pathogen fragments perhaps on that flower. Well, then a bumblebee comes by later, or a wild bee of some sort comes by, picks that up, and if it's also susceptible to that disease, it may get that. So that's kind of that concept there in a little bit more detail. Recognizing, again, pollinator habitat and we're all oftentimes thinking about floral resources, making sure there's enough pollen for these bees, but nesting and overwintering is essential for their survival and their thrival as well. So there's about, kind of three categories of nesting. Ground nesters, it's going to depend on the pollinator with what that really means for what it needs. We'll go into more detail about this in a second. Stem or tunnel nesters, and then ones that actually create nests outside of stems, tunnels, and the ground. So recognizing, it takes a while to know all these things. If you could go on a whole journey trying to learn about which bees have which nesting habitats. But again, start with the crop you're trying to support. Start by learning a little bit more about those pollinators that work with that crop. And then from there, you can learn a little bit more about those pollinators, and that's what's going to help you understand more about how to protect their nesting habits or provide their nesting habits. So ground nesting bees, some of them like disturbed soil, some like undisturbed soil, some can tolerate covered soil, while others really thrive with bare soil, and even turf can be a place for ground nesting bee species of some sorts. Stem nesting bees, the mason bee, the orchard bee is an example of a classic example of something that nests in stems. And I think it's, so about 30% of bees will do this. And oftentimes you might think about preserving certain stems of flowers. Here we're showing cone flowers, echinacea. Yes, you need them to last throughout the winter time, but if you mow them over in the spring, you're still affecting their habitat, as a lot of them will actually start those nests in the spring themselves. And it just really depends on which species of bee we're talking about as to when adults emerge. But recognizing that this is an ongoing process. And this is not to say that you can't ever remove stems, but kind of thinking about strategically. Maybe there's some regions where you're going to wait a few years and then you're going to really clear the area while you're preserving another area on your site to kind of rotationally do this process. So kind of going into a little bit more details about bumblebees and mason bees and other wild bees. Unlike the honeybees, they can really tolerate a lot more. So they're going to be flying in colder weather in a little less suitable weather. Queen bumblebees are some of the earliest bees to emerge at the beginning of the growing season. So again, as you're starting to think about what are you trying to attract to your site, you want to think about what plants bloom at what times as well. It's possible to purchase both of these, as we talked about already, and you can support wild pollinators. Bumblebees, true bumblebees are social bees. So they have colonies that are started by queen bees in the spring. And they will oftentimes nest in abandoned animal burrows, tree cavities, and other protected areas, which is pretty cool. I mentioned earlier in this presentation that they practice something called buzz pollination, which can be really essential for blueberry production, and it can also be helpful for tomato production as well. Mason bees, there's about 22 different species in Minnesota. They tend to be more solitary in nature and they nest in stems. So again, and whether or not they prefer some of those like actual, stem, colony support type projects or having something that's out there more naturally, more likely for commercial growers having those the pollinator habitat is going to be most helpful, but just recognize that those other options are out there. And they can really help pollinate apples, blueberries, tart cherries, strawberries, and cherries. So again, they're more active with fruit crops. So if you're working with vegetable crops, this type of bee might be helpful. But is it going to be the one you want to focus on? Probably not quite as much. Um, and then again, just to throw another couple of species out here, cellophane bees. We have about 25 species in Minnesota. These are smaller bees. They can help with apple and blueberry pollination. They are also solitary, but unlike the mason bee, they're going to be ground nesters and they are also active in the early spring. So again, thinking about when is everything blooming? How do you support these bees? When are they most active? And then there are longhorn bees, which longhorn bees, what what you're going to be most familiar with are squash bees, which really co-evolved with cucurbits like cucumbers and squash and pumpkins. And they like patches of bare ground. So again, maintaining some of that, not having every square inch tilled is going to be helpful to thinking about how to preserve these species. And I'll flip through a few studies here just to kind of give you some support. And again, whenever I share studies on webinars or presentations, I like to remind folks that the research I'm sharing, in order to really apply it to your own site, you want to be thinking about what crops were being studied, where was this done, how was it done, in order to kind of recognize, how much does this apply to what you're doing here. So this is a study that was done in 2019, a little bit more recently. Pollination by wild bees yields larger strawberries than pollination by honeybees. So again, which pollinators do you want to work with is going to depend on the crop you have. And in the case of strawberries, even though the same amount of pollen was deposited with each flower that was visited by both honeybees and wild bees, the strawberries that developed from the wild bee visitations tended to be heavier, which ended up leading to a heavier yield overall. And just recognizing again that in some cases, even having those honeybees, even it wasn't even just that it didn't help, but it actually was a little bit detrimental when they displaced certain wild pollinators. So that's really helpful to recognize. And then another study here, even they kind of, worked with hummingbirds even, which we're focusing less on that today. But hummingbirds, honeybees, and wild insect pollinators affect yield and berry quality of blueberries depending on cultivar and farm spatial context. This only looked at two species of blueberries, and they were high bush blueberries. So these are not our hybrids like Superior or North Blue, for example. These are things like Patriot would be one example of a high bush blueberry. And even though they were just looking at two types of blueberries, again, the results were very dependent on the cultivar, which also, cultivated variety or variety of the blueberry. So how many and the types of pollinators really affected the yield and berry size. So they saw more yield or positive impact on yield with big size bees, which, that kind of means bumblebees as well as hummingbirds, although the wild bees had a larger impact than the hummingbirds did. So this is not to say everybody should be going out to promote hummingbirds as well, if you're growing blueberries, but it's interesting to note. And honeybees, again, like in the case of some berry crops, it can actually be detrimental to have honeybees. However, this is not to say you should never have honeybees. You really have to think about what's going to be working best for you on your site. And forested areas were impactful to pollinators. And so I'm mentioning this because, we're thinking about ecology and kind of like influencing the agroecology when it comes to developing wild pollinator habitat. So even though forested areas can be impactful in pollinators and probably help a few other beneficial insects, recognizing that sometimes forest edges can have a negative impact on crops when you have things like spotted wing Drosophila risk or plum curculio, for example. So it's all about thinking about balancing out the ecology, which I'll probably mention that again. Um, and this is just a quick summary here. One last study. This is just really to say that plant diversity is helpful, right? So we always look at, having a higher diversity means there's more resilient, even with crops, right? If one crop fails, maybe something else survives. But this study was called Local Plant Diversity Across Multiple Habitats Supports a Diverse Wild Bee Community. And this was in Pennsylvania, so a little further away, but still pretty relevant. And basically, the summary of all of this was that the quantity and quality of forest edges, as well as diversity of these pollinator crops, did help with pollination in general, which I think that's probably pretty logical for most folks, but there is research that backs that up. Just sharing this quickly with raspberries for those on the call who might be growing raspberries. A lot of raspberry varieties are self-fertile, but they benefit from cross-pollination. So again, it can increase druplet size. And this is one case where honeybees are not impacting the fruit size as much as, what we saw with strawberries and blueberries, for example. So, what do you want to think about again when you're on this journey of thinking about supporting wild pollinators? You want to think about your land, your crops, and what resources are already available to support pollinators. When are they in bloom? So, I've already been kind of talking about this throughout the presentation, but we'll go into this in more depth now. Why do we want to enhance and create habitat? We want to be supporting, we can support wild bees, we can support honeybees that are on site. We're increasing resilience because they have enough food. They're not, struggling in that way. And again, this can also help with other beneficial insects, predatory insects, parasitoids that are going to parasitize certain, pests and, helps your bees stay on site. But it's going to help your bees stay on site if you have, sort of the right setup with everything. So again, timing, what crops you choose, all of that's going to matter. So some example habitats, cover crops or intercropping, that can all be helpful. But again, being aware of if you are spraying, when are you spraying, what's in bloom, are you attracting pollinators and spraying at the same time? That's going to create what's called a trap crop and be an issue for pollinator populations. Permanent wildflower areas, this is going to be most commonly supported with certain cost share programs I'll be sharing about in a little bit here. And so there are certain agencies like NRCS that can really help you figure out a whole plan for this, which I'll show an example in just a moment here. Forest plantings, riparian buffers, which are going to be more near waterways, trying to help capture nutrients before they run off. But they can also have double benefits. So you can have pollinator plantings there, and then hedgerows as well is another example. So if you already have things on site, you can think about more enhancing your pollinator habitat. So practices like selective mowing, weed control, you can help to decrease competition with invasive plants and increase pollinator friendly plants. And sometimes, You might just want to think about the land and instead of maximizing yield wherever you can by planting crops in every area of land, you might want to take advantage of, various like what would be called like, scrubby land or low production areas and use that, reserve that for your pollinator plantings rather than trying to, squeeze every bit of yield out of the land you have. And as I already mentioned, again, this is really about managing ecology. So there might be some trade-offs at times, and you really have to figure out for yourself what's going to be worth it for you. So, again, tips for all of this, thinking about do you already have plants on site that act as pollinator resources? What time are they in bloom? How much do you have? Which types of pollinators might be attracted to those plants? Know which ones you want to attract, understand their preferences, and then finding cost share programs again, which we'll mention in just a little bit here to support your efforts. Ideally, you want to plant about three types of pollinator crops that bloom early on in the season, mid-season, and then late in the season to avoid any dry gaps. So some crops are going to be more continuously producing flowers. This is going to be your annual fruit crops like pumpkins and melons, cucumbers, right? They're going to continue to bloom, but they're planted at a specific time, usually not planted until after May, for example, when the risk of frost is low. So, what do you have that's available to support pollinators as they start to emerge until that time period? And a different note, you have things like apples or blueberries that will really just be blooming for a short amount of time. And it's great, it's wonderful, it's a large amount of resources for the short amount of time. But then after that, there's nothing available. You can call that a dry spell, where you will really want to be thinking about how are you providing resources during that time. You want to give yourself time to think about this. This isn't necessarily going to be a process of just scattering seed and leaving it and hoping that something grows out. Similar to any other type of planting, you want to have a strategy. You want to be thinking about how you're going to do it, how you're really going to support establishment in this way. And just remembering that your resources for pollinators is not always just those pollinator plantings, but is there water on site? What's available for overwintering? All of that's going to be essential for pollinators. So if you don't know where to start and you really are in the dream phase and you're trying to make a plan, we did produce one more resource for you all, which is on our website, and there's a QR code for you all here. And this is called the Pollinator Management Plan. This is a little different than the technical guide. The technical guide is going to go into huge detail with nice, pretty pictures. So again, it's a nice, easy read, but it's got a lot more details to it. Whereas this is about creating a vision, thinking about your budget, thinking about your timeline. So I know we're starting to warm up here, but this is a good one to look through when it's kind of a rainy day and you've got a cup of tea and you have some time to sit down and do all of that. So again, here's the guide with that link there. So you can really think about, checking this guide out. If you saw me this winter, I was carrying these around and giving these out to folks. So yeah, potentially if you're at a field day this summer, I might have something available as well, but it is online. You can also print it out yourself and have this available. The Xerxes Society, so I mentioned we worked a lot with Pollinator Partnership for this project, but the Xerxes Society has a bunch of resources. They're very well supported in what they provide in regards to information about pollinator plantings. And this is a really great resource called Midwest Pollinator Plants. You can see in the side there, it's got the bloom period, so it's going to let you know, if you choose plants from some of these categories, you're going to be able to cover a wider range of support for different insect pollinators. It's got common names as well as a scientific name. And in the notes, you're going to see things like which types of pollinators they might attract. So that's really helpful. You can see with the cream wild indigo at the top there, it says visited by queen bumblebees. So again, just a really good resource out there. The Xerxes Society also has a resource that's a little, it's not quite the same as that more dreamy phase pollinator planting. This is very like technical. you're going to be thinking about which plants you want to put in and you're making a plan. And this is something that you might want to use when you're working with a cost share agency to help you to install some of these. So this is just an example of what this could look like, where you have your common or scientific name, some notes that you want on there. Is this an annual or perennial plant? When does it bloom? To really help you not feel lost in the process of doing this. And this is an example from White Pine Berry Farm, which is actually a farm close to the Minnesota-Wisconsin border. They do both organic and conventional strawberries, as well as a bunch of different berry crops. They worked with NRCS to put in a couple of different pollinator planting sites. And this is directly from their NRCS plan. So you can see they have a bunch of different plants that they're working with. And in this case, those details about when they bloom aren't there, but that was kind of done in the consideration process. And they even noted when, certain plants would attract butterflies. So again, there's research that shows that people like to watch animals more than plants, which as somebody who's a horticulturalist sometimes bums me out a little bit. But insects move around a lot. And so, as long as you can start to communicate with people who might be on your site about the difference between wasps, which can be a burden in the fall, and actual bees, as well as these butterflies that might be attractive, this becomes another value added component of your farm, depending. And again, this is just a few more plants that were on that list. So the Minnesota Department of Agriculture has a really big resource list. I do not have a QR code for this on this slide, but you can just look up MDA Pollinator Toolbox, and there's a list of a bunch of different cost share programs that you can work with to plant pollinator habitat, which is really cool. And again, it's kind of all in one place, but I'll cover a few of them here today. So thinking about, again, working with your local NRCS, the EQIP grant, and there might be, again, talking to them about eligibility is going to be important. But from what I understand, they can usually pay up to about 70%, 75% of that process. And again, you are going to be in a position where either you're maintaining control or you own the land you're working with. There's some income requirements and other compliances that you'll want to check with, but that's a really great place to start. There's also the CSP program. And again, this is about wildlife habitat, but it can apply to pollinator habitat, and there's just some eligibility considerations. This is a little bit more private sector, but it's still another cost share program that you can look into. This is for the Midwest. So even if you're in Wisconsin or Iowa on the call today, Iowa, I recently gave a presentation about pollinators in Iowa. There's actually quite a few cost share programs there, which is pretty cool to know. But this is the American Farmland Trust. It's in cooperation with Syngenta, but they do have a program where they'll pay about $100 per acre. And I believe that this can be in conjunction with other programs that you're working with. So again, really helpful to kind of see that there are ways to support you out there if you're looking where to start. So we'll end the call today talking a little bit about integrated pest management, which IPM, integrated pest management. Sometimes when pollinators are involved, it's called IPPM, integrated pest and pollinator management. And this is really about, managing pests in a way that's strategic, where you're not harming pollinators around you. And that's helpful for so many different ways, saving money. There's other reasons why you don't want a calendar spray. We're not going to go into that too much today. But having a good integrated pest management mindset really relates to recognizing having good knowledge about your values, your goals, your crops, the pollinators you're working with, the pests you're working with. Using tools to trap, track, and scout pests is helpful. And then, making decisions that are informed, taking action when needed, and assessing how things went, and then changing your plan. Something that's really interesting. So glyphosate's been in the news a little bit more recently, and it's unfortunate to recognize, this more recent study, 2018, that glyphosate can have negative impacts on bees. And it depends on the bee species and what types of enzymes that they have in their gut. But glyphosate can impact some of these enzymes and lead to like colony decline. Is it going to be an acute death? Right away within 24 hours, everything is dead? Probably not, but there is an impact on bee health. So again, this goes beyond just insecticide use and being careful with insecticide use. We can't, be in control of everything, but it's helpful to kind of recognize that. And then there's the concern, I'm throwing up the study here, just to recognize that there's a concern of off-site, off-farm insecticide and pesticide use as it impacts bees as well. So there are things like if you are managing honeybees, there's bee check, I think it's called, and that can put your bees on the map to help people understand where your bees are. So if they're spraying, being mindful of that. What are the exposure routes for bees? Well, there's direct, which is what we mostly think about, right? If you're spraying an insecticide or a pesticide and the bee gets sprayed, that's not good, right? And that's why it's not good to spray during bloom. But it's also about the residuals. How long does a pesticide last on a flower? And maybe a bee comes by 18 hours later and there's still some residual activity happening. Drift. So again, this is you spray something and it kind of drifts over. Maybe the water gets impacted or water gets contaminated, and then bees are, infected that way. And then there's nest and hive contamination. Similar to what I mentioned with the glyphosate being sublethal, not everything kills bees immediately. But if it's lethal, then there's going to be a quick death. If you're spraying carbaryl, for example, that's going to lead to bee death pretty quickly. But there's other issues, from different products where it's going to impact maybe how they reproduce, how well they fly, what is their immune system like. And there are certain products where if they're working together, they're going to have synergistic effects and cause issues maybe less on their own, but working together, they cause more issues. And not all effects are straightforward. Again, it's going to depend on the bee species. This is just an example of a pyrethroid where some bees might be dead within 24 hours. I think that's an alfalfa leafcutter bee in the middle there. Whereas other bees, maybe some of them die, but, others are going to just be impacted, but not necessarily die. And then you have issues, again, that are sublethal with honeybees with pyrethroids. So some key steps to think about. What is your habitat when you're spraying? Did you create a trap crop because you have a bunch of crops, cover crops that are bloom around your field and you are spraying something? Again, this can be conventional products, this can be organic products. Just because something's organic doesn't mean that it is not harmful. It just means that it's meeting the organic standards for the product itself. You'll want to reduce pesticide use when you can, using resistant varieties of different crops that you're working with, going beyond chemical use, cultural practices like and using physical exclusion, mechanical strategies. I'm mentioning alternative practices like mating disruption, which is very common in apples. That can all help you reduce the pesticides you're working with. And applying pesticides not on a calendar schedule, but when you are actually noticing that they're there, noticing when they might be at peak populations, using trapping and scouting to inform you. You want to be selective with the products you use. Some products are more bee safe than others. And so if that's one of your goals, you want to kind of keep that in mind. And then again, we talked a little bit about this, but strategic timing for applications. Don't apply pesticides during bloom unless you really have to. And if you do, wait until activity is low. So this is typically going to be pre-dawn or post-dusk. There are growers who are really good at being able to spray at night. This can be challenging. In past, if I was doing something like that, I don't do well with staying awake all night, so that's a huge challenge. So kudos to those who can. But that's going to be, best practices. And this is again just what I call the IPM toolbox. thinking outside the chemical sphere or oval there, you want to think about when you can use these other techniques in order to really maximize or minimize chemical usage. How do you avoid drift? Recognizing again, you want to follow the label. If you follow the label about when you can spray, what is the wind level, you're going to be doing much better than if you're just going out and doing it, at any time. So you want to think about wind speed, what's the wind direction, as well as the temperature for things that volatilize. And then your nozzle, how heavy is the droplet size? The smaller the droplets, oftentimes you get better coverage on your crop, but that's also more likely to drift as well. And that's kind of what I have for you all today. Shorter presentation than if you came to my fruit crop presentation earlier this year. But I just want to give a shout out to the University of Minnesota Extension as well as CFANS, where our grant originally came from for this project, as well as Pollinator Partnership that collaborated with us. So with that, I will take a few questions here if I have them. Again, if I can't answer something, if there's somebody else in the audience who has an idea, you're welcome to throw something in the chat. Or, I will be able to direct you to somebody, hopefully, who knows the answer to that. So with that, I guess I'll just check in with Lauren. Lauren, do you see anything in the chat that's there?
I'm not seeing anything. Just to make sure everybody's aware, this is a recorded meeting and you guys usually send it out via email. Is that right?
I think so, yes.
Okay, that's what I thought. There's a couple people that asked about that. And then Carl Hackinson put in a resource in the chat as well.
Excellent. And that's, I'm guessing, NRCS resource?
AA
Carl works for
pollen.
NRCS in Hennepin
Oh,
County. So thanks for being on the call, Carl.
there you go.
Yeah,
Yeah,
another good person to reach out to.
that was hi, this is Carl. That was
Hey,
for
Carl.
mostly for NRCS staff, but I thought I'd just share it. Mm.
Great. Thank you
I
so
didn't
much.
I didn't have that I didn't have the resources today in there, but um yeah, so when people are doing what we call technical assistance, they can hand it out and people can look around, find what they need maybe.
That's
Thanks.
great. Thanks, Carl. Thanks for being on the call today.
Yeah.
And there are a few questions popping in here. So,
Okay.
are there any good resources for BID? I'm from Morris, Stevens County, and would love to know what is out there.
We do have one web page, and I'm guessing again, this would be if you were to email somebody at the Bee Center or at the Bee Lab for the University of Minnesota, they could direct you to more resources. But if you, we might be able to find something here. I'm not sure if you can Google Lauren. We have one web page that lists a number of different bees. I don't have like a favorite bee ID resource. I'm guessing that there's some hefty guides out there as well. But we do have at least one resource out there or one web page that kind of goes into more details about that. So great question. Definitely one for Elaine Evans at the V Lab. I'm sure she's got a few books that she would really recommend to you. And Elaine is somebody that you can find online and you can email her directly with that question. So
Then, does one need a hygienic queen?
a hygienic queen. And would that be for honeybees or bumblebees?
Did not specify.
Yeah, if you can specify on
Honeybees.
there, honeybees, that would be another good question for Katie Lee. I don't have a good answer to that unless someone else can throw that into the chat if they're more knowledgeable on that. But Katie Lee, again, Lee is her last name. She would be somebody to reach out to if that's a specific question.
And then, might vaccination to reduce death rate?
Another really good question for Katie Lee. So yeah, again, some of these more detailed questions, the B Lab, Katie's going to have more information about that. Let me see, I can also flip to Katie's slide here and throw that up so that folks have it.
Yeah, and I just put her email in the
Oh,
chat
nice.
too.
Perfect. We'll just have Katie there. Yeah. And then anything else, Lauren, from the chat that we want to pull up?
Nope, nothing
Good.
in the
Okay.
chat.
Yeah.
Others can unmute if you do have questions.
Yeah. Feel free to
Otherwise, yeah.
unmute. Otherwise, I think we'll just kind of leave it at that, and I guess I'll stop sharing my screen here. Thanks for coming to this presentation today. And yeah, again, you can email me. Maybe can throw, I'll throw my email in there quick as well. If you have more questions, feel free to reach out to me, Katie Lee, or again, Elaine Evans is another person. But thanks for being on the call today, and I think we'll end it here. So have a great afternoon, everybody. Hey, bye.